Hey fellow knitters, Club Kid Knitter here. I know this has taken forever for me to complete, but it's finally here. Seaming with the Kitchener Stitch Part 2. This represents the final video in the Hexagonal Knitting Series. Check the description section below the video for the entire catalog listing of each video within the series. I apologize this took me so long. I was supposed to do this last year, but encountered a family tragedy requiring me to travel back and forth between my home here in Kansas and my parents' home in South Florida for nearly a year. I was tending to my mom's cats down there while making short-lived trips back here in order to prepare and oversee improvements to my home in order to support the addition of 2 more cats on top of the one Linden I adopted, now going on 2 years ago. We installed hardwoods in place of the carpeting in the bedrooms to essentially expand the footprint of the house to ensure plenty of room for each feline. Once I was able to get their inoculations up to date in Florida and their travel documents, my daughter helped me fly them here to Kansas. It took a while for my mom's cats and our already adopted cat to get along. The happy news is they all acclimated well with one another. It was a promise that I made to my mom that if anything ever happened to her, I would take them in and love them as she did. Anyway, spending so much time in Florida, on top of the constant state of flux with my life, prevented me from having access to my studio here in Kansas. I'm back at home again permanently, and have been busy creating, editing, and publishing new content here on my channel, as well as designing like crazy. So to my knitting fam, thank you so much for your patience and your understanding. This video represents part 2 of the prior video, Seaming with the Kitchener Stitch Part 1. As you recall, that was a tutorial on how to graft the interior hexagons to one another in a seamless fashion using the Kitchener stitch. In this video, I'm going to show you how to join the outer hexagons that include border edges along one or more sides. This is for the border that was designed by Janice Hope and is referenced in her Persian Dreams pattern, and is subsequently the border I happen to use for my blanket. I purchased her patterns and used a few before designing my own. I placed a link to her patterns as well as her expansion packs in the description section of this video. Before continuing on, if you just want to go straight to the demonstration if you are eager to get started, jump to the time code for Alright Already in the description section. This is a type of border that is knitted on a hexagon that is located on the outermost edge, and due to the geometry involved with the borders, ends up overlapping with other border portions by way of an extended chevron flap. Here are 2 hexagons I will be joining during this demonstration, and as you can see, here are the flaps to which I'm referring. To successfully join 2 hexagons in which there is a border, these flaps must be anchored to others by way of sewing them together in order to keep them flat. Once attached to one another at the border portion, you simply continue on grafting the bordered sides as you would in part 1 of these 2 videos. After joining each of the 2 flaps in this demonstration, I will set up the knitting needles as if to Kitchener join the 2 opposing sides extending from the border portions. I won't actually perform the technique as that is covered in part 1, in other words, the Kitchener join, but I will at least get things started to lead you off in that direction once you've joined 2 border edges. Click the information button, or the little eye that appears in the upper right corner, to take you directly to that video if you need to view it or you want a refresher. As I've mentioned, this joining demonstration requires you to join 2 flaps, one on the right side and one on the wrong side, and coincides directly with the instructions Janice provided in her pattern that also included photos. This video will walk you through and demonstrate those actual instructions. As a side mention, I am in the process of publishing a border I designed, which is different from the Persian Dreams border. I've designed it and will be testing it in the coming weeks. I've designed 2 versions, one that overlaps as this one does, as well as one that is the same design but with mitered border edges instead of overlapping ones. This video will work for my overlap border design, and I will be making one additional video that will demonstrate how to seamlessly join mitered edges using the matcher stitch, in which you will be working with the selvage edges along the border for 2 adjoining hexagons. Let's talk about a few housekeeping items. For this, you will need a tapestry needle, preferably one with a bent tip, and preferably one with a blunted one to avoid pricking yourself or inadvertently splitting stitches. Here are 2 I've purchased over the years. I'm going to use the smaller of the 2 as it is better for getting through the tiny stitches from which I'll be working, which leads me to the next thing I'd like to talk about. I have very poor vision, and I do wear corrective lenses. In this video, I'm demonstrating this process to you using a dark navy, and I do recognize that this color is a poor choice for making a tutorial for demonstration purposes. So, as you've already probably recognized, I've actually knitted stitches that I will be using in demonstrating this process in a lighter gold color. They are distinct from the other stitches, so you should be able to better follow along and see what I'm doing. These two hexagons will actually be the bottom two hexagons in the lower left corner of my blanket. These particular stitches won't really be noticeable, and one of the two sets will actually be hidden completely by a sewn-in leather tag with my maker's mark. Years ago, I purchased a magnifying lamp that uses LEDs. The glass magnifier is actually a window that is framed from underneath by a ring of lights. I'm pulling this down so that you can see what I'm talking about. Over the years, I've always used this for weaving in ends or for making tedious corrections like when I've dropped stitches and needed to manually rebuild or recreate them. My point is, between my poor eyesight and working on small, detailed stitch work with the darkest of colors, for example, weaving in ends, I really love having such a lamp. I would use this in creating this tutorial, but it would unfortunately obscure your view as it would have to fit in between my camera lens and my work. You'd either end up seeing the back of my head or a really distorted view through the magnifying glass due to the different focal lengths between it and my camera. For those out there with poor eyesight, I highly recommend having one of these, or something similar. I paid $35 for this one, and I've had it for about 8 years, and it's held up really great. Right now, I use it primarily for additional lighting within my studio, because I found a new toy that will not only allow me to see better in any magnified fashion, but it does not affect your ability to clearly see my work. These are a pair of dental loops, and I absolutely love them. I did research these for quite some time before purchasing them online. I read through several reviews, and more specifically the negative ones, for dozens of different and in some cases similar products. These received the most praise for how they were advertised and what they promised they could do, and I do love them. With a traditional loop, it's a single one that you have to hold to one eye and then bring the object you are viewing right up to your face. Kind of like what photographers do when viewing a negative contact sheet, or what jewelers do when cutting facets into a diamond. This intimacy has to do with the focal length of the lens. The focal length for the monocular loop is around 1 inch or so. Clearly that would not work for what it is I'm attempting. The focal length for the dental loops, however, is 450 millimeters, which is about arm's length, and is perfect for what I need, and it's hands-free. The magnification is 3.5 times, so the view is nice and big, sharp and crystal clear. They are also bifocal, allowing depth of field and true 3-dimensional viewing, and they do fit right over my corrective lenses. It includes its own LED light, which I will be using in this video for additional lighting purposes. Everything flips up and down, and the power pack for it is rechargeable, so you are literally not attached to an outlet on your wall. It's completely mobile. Now, the unit itself is a little heavy and will cause your glasses to slip away from your face. However, they included this adjustable bungee-like cord, which keeps everything fixated and held in proper place. Also, for those who do not wear corrective lenses, you may use these clear lenses that came with the set instead. In fact, you will have to use them because the dental loops must attach to those. This product comes with hardware to accomplish that, and even included a jeweler's Phillips head screwdriver to tighten or loosen the adjustable hinges. It's perfect. Anyway, I will be using these so I can see, and in my video editing software, I will zoom up nice and close so you can see really clearly what I'm doing. The price for these is around $65. I placed links to both the lamp and the dental loops in the description section below. These are links to the ones I actually purchased, or the ones that I've just shown you. Before we go on, we need to discuss flap direction. I choose to do what I refer to as a left-leaning border. This tutorial is designed based upon that. If you choose to do a right-leaning border, you'll need to reverse the order in which you attach your flaps. In essence, you would begin on the wrong side and then finish on the right side. I do recommend the left-leaning border, and this is why. The tail from your completed borders will always be on the left side. This is due to the fact that you cast off after completing an even row, row 20. Now, notice if I place this flap, the left flap, under the right flap of the hexagon to your left, this would be a right-leaning border. And as you can see, the tail is now on the wrong side, which means you'll have to begin on that side. Some folks may choose to alternate and have one hexagon on top of 2 others on either side, or underneath 2 others, again on either side. If you do such a thing, for symmetry purposes, make sure the total number of outer hexagons support such a layout. I drew these visual aids in Photoshop, and they serve as a guide for where your needle is supposed to go when doing this, so you can match it from stitch to stitch to what you will be doing with your own work. I'll be referring to it as I insert my tapestry needle. Also, I will not skip through any of this demonstration. I will be sewing each and every stitch, which is one of the reasons why this video is rather long. As you can see, there are two of these, as we will be tacking down two flaps. One flap on the right side, which is this one, and one flap on the wrong side, which is this one. If you notice, one side is primarily knitted stitches, and the other side is primarily purl stitches, which coincide with the right and wrong sides, respectively. In any event, you can see the actual stitches from which we'll be working, and the pattern ties directly to some of Janice Hope's border, namely the first 3 rows. I've placed a link for PDF versions for both pages in the description section. It's one document containing 2 pages. Let's talk a little bit about these drawings and everything that's going on. This row labeled 47 is the last round of the actual hexagon. Everything down from this, so rows 1, 2, and 3, are the first 3 rows of the border portion. You'll also notice everything is upside down, and that is exactly how we'll be working the right side. I've represented everything this way because I find it awkward working from left to right because I'm right-handed and always direct a sewing needle from right to left. So that's why this is upside down. If you do want to work from left to right, simply turn the page around. Let's talk about the anatomy of the knitted stitch. Knitting, simply put, is just a string that works its way across the fabric in a serpentine fashion. It goes up and down as it makes its journey, and as a matter of fact, this is exactly what the Kitchener stitch is. This visual aid traces out these stitches. Now, if you notice closer within the image, the string traces 2 identical shapes that oppose one another, simply by the fact that those 2 shapes share a side or portion. In other words, they share a leg. You have up symbols, and you have down symbols. It's the difference between an upward pointed stitch and a downward pointed stitch that becomes apparent by merely shifting your field of vision by half of a stitch. See? Up, down, up, down, up, down. We want to be cognizant of this because we will need to switch back and forth with these 2 stitch directions as we work our way across the flap as we are sewing it into its neighboring hexagon. To reiterate, the only row we will focus on is row 1 of the border, the one with the gold stitches. The next thing we need to focus our attention on is the side or edge of the chevron portion of the border, or the flap to the border. This is what is normally referred to as a salvage edge. Typically, when we knit flat, upon completing or knitting the very last stitch, we turn our work and begin purling with the very first stitch that was just knitted on the prior row. As a result, you normally have a not so nice looking edge on your knitting. The way to avoid this and to have a nice and neat chained edge like this is to always slip the very first stitch knitwise with the yarn behind when working a right side row, and to slip the first stitch purlwise with the yarn in front when working a wrong side row. In doing either slip, 2 things occur. The first is that the stitch is a long stitch along the edge that spans 2 rows. This is easy to see if you trace along the string when it leaves the row below and then goes into the row above. One leg is longer than the other, and it's always the leg that leaves or exits from the bottom row. The other leg is shorter as it is technically the first stitch of a new row. Weird, I know. It looks like a funny chain stitch in which one leg of the chain has a longer portion to the other leg, which has a shorter portion. It's kind of like a lopsided stitch. That's the first thing. The second thing, which is the most important, is that when holding the yarn behind when slipping knitwise, or holding the yarn in front when slipping purlwise, in either case, you are pulling or flipping the proper chain behind to the wrong side of your work. Essentially, it is hidden, and the only way to see it is to look on the back. The other curious thing is that the 2 chains, the one seen from the front and the one seen from the back, oppose one another and are going in opposite directions. I'm going to go into more detail about this chain. We will be working with a side, or leg, really of the chain stitch that is shared between the front sequence of chains and the back sequence of chains. Notice how the perspective of which way the chained stitches point changes when you peek on the back side. Don't worry, however. We aren't working from the back, but from the front, because that leg, which is shared, is visible to us from the right side. The chain stitches that are drawn on the visual aid shows exactly how the chain would look if the entire border except this chain of stitches were somehow removed. Again, we can see the top portion of the chain from the right side, but we cannot see the bottom part as it is obscured by the border itself. I've drawn it in, however, so that you can familiarize yourself with the true nature of this chain of stitches. To reiterate, we will be working with the very tops of those elongated chain of stitches. Moreover, the string with which we will be sewing will visit each of these elongated stitches with the exception of the very first one 2 times. The first elongated chain stitch will be tacked down due to the slip knot that I made upon casting off the very last stitch. Next, let's look exactly what is going on with the right side. I will be taking the tail coming off of this border and using it to sew down this particular flap to the opposing hexagon. Now, there are a sequence of 10 chain stitches along the side of the border because the border itself is 20 rows tall, and because each of these elongated stitches along the edge is shared between 2 rows, 20 rows divided by 2 rows per stitch is 10 elongated stitches. Now, the length of these 10 loops running down the side of the border is 15 stitches long. In other words, 15 columns of knitted or purled stitches are the same length as the side of the border, which is made up of 10 double stitches. Another way to look at it is each of these 10 elongated stitches equals 1.5 knitted or purled stitches column-wise, and 1.5 times 10 is, again, 15. In order to identify where to begin to insert your tapestry needle into row 1 of the opposing hexagon's border, you will need to, starting from the left and going towards the right, count out 15 stitches. The pattern for the first row of border is knit 5 stitches, purl 1 stitch, knit 5 stitches, purl 1 stitch. So far, that's 12 stitches. So we need to keep going and count out an additional 3 stitches. The easiest and quickest way I do this is to scan the border and look for a row that has purl bumps with a stretch of 5 stitches in between. This is that row. I simply look for the second purl bump from the left and then count 3 full stitches to the right of it. Now notice the direction of the stitch I stopped on. It's an up stitch. But that same stitch is a down stitch if you turn everything 180 degrees. Don't let this confuse you. Try to block out all other stitches in the rows both above and below the one in which you are working. You do need to have a little tunnel vision for this. With this first stitch, which again is stitch 15, you will insert the needle from right to left under both legs. Next, you are going to, from above, go through the first large chain stitch here, come out from behind, and then from above go into and come out from behind again, the second chain stitch to the left. This represents the first time we are visiting this second stitch. Now we need to go back to the opposing hexagon. We need to move our eyes over a half of a stitch. If I were to go over 0 stitches, I would insert my needle here into the very next leg of the stitch I see. If I were to go over 1 stitch, I would insert my needle here, basically skipping 2 legs. So, if I say go over half of a stitch, I need to skip 1 leg and insert my needle under the next 2 to the left of it. But look, when you've done this, now the stitches for that column are pointing in the down direction. This is good. You want to be sure and remain in the same row throughout this process. When I demonstrate this, I'll show you a trick where with the tip of your left ring finger and from behind, you stretch the fabric to look for and follow the string that is going serpentine. This will help you to remain in the proper row. Next, what you are going to do is come back down to revisit stitch 2 for the second time by inserting your needle from above and through to the back, bringing your needle back around, and now we're going to visit stitch 3 for the first time. Next, it's back to the opposing hexagon. Again, we are going to move over a half of a stitch which puts us into a column of stitches that again are pointing in the up direction. It happens to be the purled stitch. And then go behind both legs, and then back to the border edge. Go and revisit stitch 3 a second time, and then stitch 4 for the first time, and so on. I will demonstrate all of this stitch for stitch. I want you to be familiar with what I'm doing and why. I do recommend referring to this chart for the first few times until getting this down. The more you do this, the easier it will become. Once you have finished the entire row, you want to insert the needle in between the gap of the two hexagons in order to bring your working yarn to the wrong side of your work. After doing so, simply turn or flip the top of the two hexagons away from you. This is now how we will be working to finish tacking down the flap from the other hexagon. Remember, we have 2 flaps to tack down. When you flipped your work over, you will be working from the right flap wrong side visual aid. Again, you will be working from right to left. This is the map of where you will need to guide your tapestry needle. Also, pay particular close attention to the black arrows that are on top of the red colored strings, as they indicate which direction your needle should be pointing. Notice again that you are working with row 1 of the hexagon's border, and as was for the right side, you will be working with 15 stitches on this wrong side, most of which will obviously be purled stitches rather than knitted ones. The wrong side is markedly different from the right side, as is the case with stockinette stitch in general. We're ready to get started. Now, real quick, if you're using threads as lifelines for the outer sets of stitches going down from each border side, I recommend tucking them out of the way behind your work like I did here. You want to keep them out of the way so they don't become snagged inside of your sewing or constantly rubbing along the yarn that you are drawing. The latter can cause them to begin felting together. So restraining them from behind is always the best way to ensure that this won't occur. Okay, so we first need to identify our first stitch to go behind with our tapestry needle. Remember, we are working the left flap on the right side. That's the first visual aid. We will sew down the other flap, which is the other visual aid, right flap, wrong side, after we finish this first flap. Identify the row of the border by looking for those purl bumps I mentioned. Remember to look for the second purl bump from the left, and then count 3 full stitches to the right. Make sure that stitch 15 is pointed in the up direction. With your tapestry needle, go behind both legs of that stitch. Draw the yarn through. Next, focus your attention on the flap. Insert your tapestry needle from front to back through the first chain. Then come back around and insert your tapestry needle, again from front to back, through the second chain. Draw your yarn all the way through. I'm going to leave about an inch of looseness for the first couple of stitches. I do recommend drawing the stitches closed no further out than from 1 or 2 stitches. This is in case you have accidentally split a stitch. You will need to address this immediately, as you will not be able to draw the stitches closed after and beyond the point you split a stitch. Next, back to the opposing border. Move over 1/2 of a stitch from the prior stitch. Make sure you remain in row 1. I mentioned earlier a way to make sure that you stay within the row. From behind and with the tip of your left ring finger, you may stretch your work to identify that serpentine aspect of the knitted stitch to see that indeed you are in the same row. Insert your needle under both legs of the stitch, which now points in the down direction, and draw your yarn through. Next, it's back to the border edge. Notice how you can see that stitch 2 has already been visited once. Now we're going to visit it for the second time by inserting the tapestry needle from front to back through that stitch, bring the needle back around, and now we're going to go and visit stitch 3 for the first time by inserting the needle from front to back. Draw the yarn through. Now, at this point, I'm going to tighten my stitches. You need to make sure that you apply pressure to the corner where the flap meets the opposing hexagon and only pull gently, just enough to see the stitches draw closed. You do not want your join to turn into an accordion, which you risk doing by either drawing too tightly or drawing when you've made several stitches before doing so. Next, it's back to the opposing hexagon. Move over half of a stitch while remaining in that row, row 1. If you need help, look to where the yarn is exiting the stitch to the right. Once identifying this, you should be able to easily remain within the row. This next stitch is pointed in the up direction, and it also happens to be the first of 2 purl bumps you will encounter. Insert your tapestry needle behind both legs and draw the yarn all the way through. Next, it's back to the border to revisit stitch 3 for a second time. Again, stretch your knitting slightly to look for the yarn exiting stitch 3 and insert your needle from front to back into that very same stitch for a second pass. And then we will visit stitch 4 for the first time. Draw your yarn through. Back to the opposing hexagon. Move over half of a stitch, and the stitch is pointed in the down direction. Insert your needle behind both legs. Again, refer to the visual aid and look closely at the anatomy of what you're inserting your needle into, because things do look a little weird and different when working with a leg that is shared between a knitted stitch and a purled one. Draw your yarn through. Next, it's back to the border edge. We need to visit stitch 4 for a second time. Insert your needle from front to back, and then visit stitch 5 for the first time. Draw the yarn all the way through. Next, it's back to the opposing hexagon. Move to the left by 1/2 of a stitch to the stitch that is pointed in the up direction. Insert your needle behind both legs and draw your yarn through. And then next, it's back to the border edge again. We're going to visit stitch 5 for a second time, and then into stitch 6 for the first time, and draw your yarn through. And I'm again going to draw the stitches closed. So we're at this point in which we are halfway finished with the first flap. Simply follow along with me through the end of this flap. Okay, the first flap is completed. Now we lay our tapestry needle in between the two hexagons, and then we're going to flip the bottom up and then flip the entire hexagon over. Never work from a half-turned hexagon, or a half-flipped hexagon, rather. You may end up putting your tapestry needle through your hexagon twice, and then end up with a huge mess you will have to undo and start again. Always work on a table or something flat, and with your hexagons completely flat as well. Now we are going to work the right flap from the wrong side. Remember, refer to the visual aid with this title. It's the second of the two. We're going to begin with the opposing hexagon first by inserting your needle behind both legs of the first large loop exiting from the M1R or make one right stitch you made during row 1 of the border. This does indeed represent row 1 of the border, but from the wrong side. Next, it's up to the border edge. Insert your needle from front to back into the first border side stitch and make sure it's the bottom leg of that stitch. Remember, this bottom leg is the one that is shared between this chain and the top of the chain from the right side. It may seem we're doing things upside down, and that is because we literally are. We're on the wrong side and working the right flap, as opposed to the right side with the left flap. Again, we only visit the first chain once. Next, we'll visit the second chain stitch for the first time. Draw your yarn through. Now it's back to the opposing hexagon. We need to move over half of a stitch and go under both legs of the stitch that is in the up direction. Draw your yarn through, and now back to the side of the border above to revisit stitch 2 a second time, and then around to visit stitch 3 for the first time. And then draw your yarn through. Next, it's back to the opposing hexagon, and move over a half of a stitch, going behind both legs of the stitch that is pointed in the down direction. Next, I'm going to draw the first 2 sets of stitches closed by holding the rightmost portion and lightly pulling. Next, it's back to the border edge to revisit stitch 3 a second time, and then stitch 4 for a first time. Draw your yarn through. Next, back to the opposing hexagon and move over half of a stitch to one that is pointed in the up direction. Go behind both legs. Draw your yarn through. Now back up to the border edge and revisit stitch 4 a second time, and then into stitch 5 for the first time. And draw your yarn through. Next, back to the opposing hexagon and move over half of a stitch to the one pointed in the down direction. Draw your yarn through, and then draw those stitches closed. Always apply pressure to the right of the point you closed the prior stitches. Next, back to the border edge above to revisit stitch 5 a second time, and then into stitch 6 for the first time, and draw your yarn through. Okay, so we're at the halfway point for this flap. Follow along with me to complete the second half. We've successfully joined both flaps of the borders, and I've moved each set of stitches to the sides extending from the border onto needles to continue joining the hexagons using the Kitchener stitch. One final note. If you notice, your working yarn is all the way over here when it needs to be here at the actual joint, because this is where we need to do the setup for our Kitchener graft. It's very easy to get back to what I call home base. All you're going to do is a whip stitch through the tops of the chained edge. I simply insert my needle through every other leg of those slip stitches and stop once I've reached the center of the two sides of the border edges. Be mindful when drawing your working yarn through not to pull too tight. I pull it until it just closes that first loop on the corner. To summarize, we have joined the left flap to the opposing hexagon via the right side, and we've also joined the right flap to the opposing hexagon via the wrong side, so that both flaps lie flat or flush to the blanket border. I hope you found this video helpful, and again, I do apologize this took me so long to do. This video concludes the Hexagonal Knitting Series. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like. I welcome any and all comments and feedback, and please subscribe to my channel for more tutorials, techniques, and tips. Thank you again for watching, and as always, happy knitting!